Hi, everyone, and welcome to our panel, Teaching Digital Activism, Case Studies from Graduate Student Perspectives. We are 3 PhD students at the University of Maryland studying language, writing, and rhetoric, and teaching about rhetoric, digital activism, and writing. We, as a panel, are concerned with how to ethically engage students in learning about, engaging with, and practicing rhetoric in digital spaces, which led us to this curated panel today. Today, I'm going to talk to you about teaching digital activism on social media using labor-based grading. My name is Alexis Walston, and I've got my email and my Twitter handle here. I encourage you to reach out and chat with me about anything you see. And I've also linked a transcript to this extemporaneous presentation in the Google Drive, so please feel free to follow along there. Today, I am going to talk about my English 294 Persuasion and Cleverness in Social Media course. And then I will tell you guys about the digital activism theme used there and the sub-themes. I'll share with you what students learned and explain how labor-based grading facilitated that learning and conclude with some of my reflections. English 294, Persuasion and Cleverness in Social Media is a general education course delivered virtually via Zoom in spring 2021. The University of Maryland is flexible with how we approach our general education courses in the English department. So I consulted previous syllabi for this class, and I looked at recent literature on this topic to narrow down a theme, which I defined as digital activism, and I'll speak more about that in a second. For this class, I scaffolded the syllabus around a final research paper that engaged with both primary and secondary research for students ultimately to craft an original argument about social media and rhetoric in relation to digital activism. I assessed all of my students' work using labor-based grading as described by Asao B. Inouye, and I have a link to the syllabus in this slide deck if you want to check out the specific readings and assignments and the grading contract. I landed on the digital activism theme for a handful of reasons. The first of which being, as I surveyed the literature about digital rhetoric and social media, there is a very strong leaning toward digital activism. So hashtag activism, techno-feminism, and others are very popular in our field right now. And so after I culminated this list of readings, I realized the digital activism theme is not just something we as scholars are writing about, but it's exigent in the moment. In 2021, we were coming off the 2020 moment, and there is so much digital activism we engaged with over the course of that year. So I decided on this theme. The ultimate goal was to encourage students to contemplate how their social media and digital interactions are inherently rhetorical, particularly what they consume, but also what they create. And at the beginning of the semester, we drew from common knowledge about digital activism to collaboratively define digital activism, social media, and rhetoric. We also, at the beginning of the semester, started with a digital rhetoric overview, which was one of my sub-themes for the class. Again, in surveying the literature, I found there were a handful of different themes and sub-themes throughout digital activism, rhetoric, and social media conversations. And once I identified those groups, I ordered them in a logical sequence to facilitate student learning throughout the semester. These sub-themes included a digital rhetoric overview, hashtag activism, techno-feminism, gender and sexuality representations, and rhetorical dating. Our early readings in digital rhetoric helped set the stage for understanding how the digital is inherently rhetorical and also what rhetoric is, which some students needed a refresher from. And how to ethically engage in studying social media was also early on in the course in this rhetoric overview section, because it was important to me that my students understood how to study social media as ethically as they could. And finally, this digital rhetoric overview helped us understand how algorithms function rhetorically. Some of these readings include Gruwell, McKee and Porter, and Beck. Hashtag activism came next, and these readings offered a really accessible way for students to see tangible results of digital activism. Hashtags are familiar, hashtags are popular, and they can do a lot of things in creating a community. So Jackson and Wells, Callison and Hermida, Wingard, Stenberg, Jackson, Bailey, and Wells all helped us see specific manifestations of digital activism via hashtags. Next, we moved into techno-feminism, where we learned how gender impacts how we engage online. Then we looked at gender and sexuality representations, specifically how social media allows us to create communities in these spaces. And we concluded with a fun unit on rhetorical dating and learned a little bit about how dating can, in fact, be both rhetorical and a form of digital activism. All of this work culminated in a research project in which students consulted primary and secondary research to craft an original argument about rhetoric, social media, and digital activism. I, as I'm sure many of you know and recognize, was so excited to see how my students grew in their projects and learned more and became more active Redders on their own social media through these projects. So students analyzed social media posts rhetorically by focusing on things like context, purpose, genre, platform affordances, and more. They practiced this skill in the first essay, which was a rhetorical analysis, and that lent itself nicely to the final paper in which they analyzed a primary social media post using the lens of secondary research. The secondary research acted both as a model for students for their own projects, and it gave students ways to think about methodology. My students consulted primary or secondary research to think about their methodology and methods so they could engage more deeply in their primary research beyond a traditional 200 level rhetorical analysis. Finally, some things that also helped with student learning was more informal student-led discussions and weekly reading groups. These really helped students articulate how they saw social media as attempting to persuade them in their day-to-day social media use. And it gave them a chance to see the theory that they read about in scholarly articles in practice. So that was a strong point in our class, was talking through how we see these things happening online in our own social media use. All of this learning was greatly facilitated by labor-based grading. So for those of you who don't know or are less familiar with labor-based grading, I'm going to offer a really brief overview, and I encourage you to shoot me an email or tweet at me if you have more questions about it. But a labor-based grading contract essentially states that if a student fulfills all the standard requirements of the course, they will receive a standard grade. And for me, that was a B+ or an 87%. As the instructor, I assessed student labor rather than quality of student writing in an attempt to resist white-centric notions of standard English as the best and most correct way to write, which is inspired by Asao B. Inouye. And if you're interested in that, I encourage you to read his book. If a student wants to increase their grade from a standard B+, they have to do extra labor to boost that grade. And if they do less than the standard requirement, their grade lowers. Negotiations are vital to the success of this contract, and it ensures fairness, accessibility, and equity. And again, I'm happy to expand on this. If you are interested, please just shoot me an email or check out my grading contract in the syllabus. So in English 294, there were tons of benefits to using labor-based grading. I'm going to list some of them now, as well as some of the tangible results. First, there was a lot more student risk-taking. Students were able to try new things and do things that they didn't know for sure fit perfectly into the prompt, but they knew they would get credit if they submitted a complete assignment on time. This also lent to flexibility in student learning. If students wanted to learn a new skill, they were able to do so through these different projects. Inouye tells us that labor-based grading gives us one of many, many different ways to work toward linguistic justice by valuing varied literacies beyond standard written English. For example, students can choose to write to a different audience outside of white middle-class academics, and they can adapt their rhetorical choices accordingly. This also, as the instructor, gave me an opportunity to give more productive feedback on writing. I found when I'm not having to justify a letter grade, the feedback I provide my students is more intentional, more robust, and is viewed much more generously. This also, labor-based grading, decreases grade anxiety for students. They know they're going to get a specific grade as long as they check off the boxes. And overall, this is, in my opinion, a more empathetic way to assess students during a pandemic. It's more flexible, it's more empathetic, and it responded to the moment that was teaching online in spring 2021. Some tangible results that I saw include students using boosters or this opportunity for doing extra work for a higher grade to do projects they were interested in. For example, I had a student who was really excited about getting a blog going, a political blog going, but she couldn't find the time to create the website, edit and revise her blog posts, brainstorm, etc. So she used that as a jumping off point for her extra labor. So I, as the instructor, was able to help her craft her website, edit her blog posts, and help think about all the things that she could do with this blog. So by the end of the semester, she not only increased her grade, but reached her own personal goal of publishing this blog. Another pro of this assessment method is that students experimented with new genres and ideas. For example, a student wanted to write her rhetorical analysis in a narrative style, and while it didn't fit the prompt perfectly, the student wanted to learn this for her own intellectual growth, and she had the ability to, and she had my support as the instructor to help her improve in that specific genre of writing. 1 year later, I'm not teaching this class anymore, and as I reflect on it, I have a couple key things to think about in terms of teaching social media, digital rhetoric, digital activism, etc. One is that most students in the Gen Z population specifically assume that social media is trying to persuade them. They are not surprised to learn this. They are often surprised to learn the depth of it, but they know it's always there. Sometimes they even welcome it. They want those targeted ads. Sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do. Similarly, students are aware of how the algorithms on social media work, and sometimes they engage with them intentionally and rhetorically to see things that they would prefer to see on their newsfeed. For example, if a student is worried that they're in an echo chamber, that one student told me how she would go and search for opinions that she knew she didn't agree with, and she would interact with those posts so she could burst out of her echo chamber. Digital literacies should not be assumed here, but establishing a baseline is helpful. So just conversing with your students, collaboratively defining things like social media and rhetoric and digital activism was a great way to establish that baseline. And finally, social media ages really quickly. I assigned an article from 2012 about YouTube, and my students read it and they were so confused. I would recommend, if you choose to teach digital activism in any capacity, make sure that you are assigning relevant, recent articles. That way your students will connect with them more. That's all I've got for y'all today. Thank you so much for listening. Again, please reach out to me via email or Twitter with thoughts, questions, or ideas. I will end my screen share now and move my Zoom bar, and I'll turn it over to Erin.
Thank you, Alexis. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Erin Green, and my title is Teaching Digital Activism Using a Feminist Rhetorical Praxis. So to give you a basic rundown of the agenda for my presentation, I'll give some background information, and then I'll go over the course that I co-taught with a professor called Feminist Critical Theory that had several different units relating to feminist theory and practices. And I focused on teaching the social media activism unit. I'll give a rundown of the progression of the project and then my own kind of reflection for this. So this was a co-listed course in the English department and Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies department called Feminist Critical Theory. It was face-to-face. and it was mostly taken by English majors and WGS majors. It was co-taught with a professor of English and writing program administrator. The projects, there were 5: a politics of my location essay, which was just a casual essay determining the kind of political identities of the students; a feminist book club where they got to choose a book in small groups and read it and present about their book as a form of feminist coalition building; a feminist social media campaign project. There was another project as well that's not related to this presentation. And lastly, they had to do a reflexive essay. So some important themes that were talked about in this course were intersectionality, COVID, women's history and public memory, rhetorical listening, allyship, activism, environmentalism, and then of course, reflection as a feminist practice. So the unit that I was kind of in charge of teaching was the social media campaign. This is the kind of description from the assignment sheet. The third major project for the semester asks you to identify a feminist issue that interests you, such as racial and gender violence, feminist climate activism, Title IX equity and sports, or reproductive rights. You'll then research this issue, develop an activist stance, and finally intervene in the discussion by creating a feminist social media campaign. The type of social media is up to you: Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, or a combination of them all, or something that was not listed in this description. So an overview of the project, the first thing that we did was review the kind of feminist practices that we learned so far in the course. So like I said before, intersectionality, identity politics, politics of location. We learned about rhetorical listening and allyship. We read some Black feminist work, queer feminist work. We talked about labor and feminism, those kinds of things. And then we read and discussed specific forms of feminist activism for various different kinds of issues. So relating to like reproductive rights, queer, LGBT activism, and environmental activism. After we read and discussed those different forms of activism, not just like digital activism, but just activism in general, the students chose a topic, and that was a feminist issue for them, and they conducted their own research on this topic. And they had to conduct research so that they were actually being informed by other people's perspectives and opinions, not just like speaking directly just like from their mouths. And after that, we as a class collaboratively reviewed the genres and styles and literacies on different social media platforms. So what does it mean to write and compose on TikTok versus Twitter versus Instagram versus any other kind of social media platform? Next, we discussed digital activism, genre conventions, and issues related to performative activism. So we kind of talked about one of the most common forms of digital activism that we did in class and read were Instagram slideshows. So we talked about the affordances and limitations of Instagram slideshows and how it could be a form of performative activism, or how it could actually lead to better kind of affordances that actually end up helping the causes that they are supporting. And then we collaboratively created guidelines for ethical digital activism based on the previous feminist scholarship we read in class. So we kind of reflected back on what did we learn about in forms of being a feminist or being an ally for feminist issues, and how those can help inform our creation and facilitating different kinds of digital activism. So we made a list and we discussed them, and then we use those set of guidelines as kind of like not really necessarily rules, but suggestions and recommendations for having an ethical social media campaign. They participated in a peer review and draft workshop of the campaigns. And then we had a campaign showcase where they got to post their social media campaigns, and then they responded. And this responding was different from like a peer review. It was responding to like the argument and brilliance of the different campaigns to show what they actually enjoyed and what was like working to kind of help uplift their peers' social media campaigns. And I have an example of a student who allowed me to use their social media campaign. They did an Instagram slideshow. One of the campaigns was an Instagram slideshow specifically about abortion policy in the United States. So here are some examples of, these are individual Instagram slides about abortion policy. So I am going to reflect back on my time teaching this specific unit, just because we talked about reflection being a rhetorical feminist practice. So one thing that really stood out to me that I felt was the most helpful was thinking about the social media campaign as a form of like procedural feminism versus just having feminist content. So yes, they did choose different content that we might normally associate with feminism, but the actual acts of doing inquiry-based research on a topic and doing rhetorical listening by getting not only an understanding of like what people are saying from different perspectives about that issue, but like why they're saying it, the cultural logics of why they're saying it, any kind of other rhetorical negotiations that are happening with that specific issue. We talked about citation practices and the ethics of that, especially in the context of misinformation and disinformation. There was a lot of collaboration with this project as a class, and then obviously the peer review draft workshop, but also during the research process and kind of the outlining and pre-composing process as well. And then they also had to do a reflection essay for their campaign about what they kind of learned from the social media campaign. And then I also just thought that it was helpful to have these nuanced discussions about the digital platforms and genres and histories and audiences and literacies, because even though they're all different forms of digital activism, doing digital activism looks different on TikTok versus Twitter versus YouTube versus any other kind of platform. And I thought it was very good that not only were we talking about these issues in feminism, but we were doing feminist rhetorical practices by engaging in rhetorical listening, inquiry-based research, citation practices, collaboration, and reflection. And that is the end of my presentation. I have my contact info below, and I'll hand it over to Rachel.
All right, thank you so much, Erin. And I will end out our panel with my presentation. So allow me to share my screen here. Okay, I'm going to get it on the right monitor display. Okay. Just give me 1 second here. There we go. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that.
We're actually seeing a different screen, I think.
Oh, you are?
Yes.
Okay, stop sharing. And let me try this again. How about now? Okay. Apologies. Okay, so, oops, not share. That's not what I want to do. Into file, slideshow, that's what I want. Okay. Hello, my name is Rachel Stroup, and again, also another PhD student at University of Maryland, College Park. Today, my presentation is titled Exploring Rhetorical Analysis Through Cancel Culture. So the term cancel culture has become a recognized term that refers to the mass censure of a figure based on that person's actions that are deemed wrong or immoral by the public. Cancel culture's emotional and political polls offers fruitful ground for first-year students to engage with questions of rhetorical ethics and circulation. As a first-year composition graduate instructor, I use cancel culture to teach students about the formation of ethos, especially in the connection between morality and credibility. This presentation tracks my process and reasoning for using cancel culture as a grounding for teaching ethos. First, I outline the extensive history of cancel culture and its nuances in the last 5 years. Then, I revisit ancient Greek understandings of ethos to unpack the impulse to cancel someone. Next, I outline my typical one-day lesson plan for teaching ethos through the lens of cancel culture. I end by relaying how this typically goes, why this lesson offers important modern political engagement for students, and I encourage instructors of first-year composition to employ aspects of this lesson in their teaching. So what is cancel culture? The act of canceling someone is an event of public ostracism of a particular person with the goal of exposing their moral character and diminishing their credibility. Notable examples include Harvey Weinstein, Colin Kaepernick, Louis C.K., and several others. But the act of canceling someone by putting them on blast in the public eye, of course, is not new. Think of how the Dreyfus affair pinned Dreyfus as a guilty character and amplified a culture of anti-Semitist fervor. Or even further, think back to the origins of the word scapegoat. The term scapegoat originates from the book of Leviticus in the Bible, when the goat symbolically carried the sins of a community and was cast away to carry away the sins. This tension between hierarchy and exclusion swings on a pendulum of the relationship between morality and credibility. New York Times writer Legaya Michon importantly contextualizes cancel culture and it's always evolving a commodity or transaction. Readers cancel magazine subscriptions, studio heads cancel TV shows, bank tellers cancel checks to show that they have been exhausted of value. Comparatively, Michon writes that as a noun, cancel culture, quote, is symbolically applied to incidents both online and off that range from vigilante justice to hostile debate to stalking, intimidation, and harassment, end quote. In addition, she contends that, quote, it's persistently attributed to the extremes of the political left and fear-mongering specter of wokeness. It's itself a freighted term originally derived and then distorted from the Black vernacular woke, which invokes a spirit of vigilance to see the world as it really is. A letter posted in Harper's Magazine on July 7, 2020, effectively tried to cancel culture. Signed by bigwig figures like Margaret Atwood, Steven Pinker, and Noam Chomsky, these are some of the many names who signed this letter. At one point, it reads, quote, the free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of liberal society, is daily becoming more constricted. While we have come to expect this on the radical right, censoriousness is also spreading more widely in our culture, and intolerance of opposing views, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, and the tendency to dissolve complex policy issues in a blinding moral certainty, end quote. And this point is important. Just turn on Fox News or MSNBC for a hint. But the predominant narrative of cancel culture in the last 5 years or so has been the left side coming together to stand for their liberal values by admonishing a figure who acted in a way that departs from these values. This figure could certainly be someone on the right, like Trump, one of the bigger targets of cancel culture that only inflated his fandom, or it could be someone typically associated with the left, like Chrissy Teigen, who was recently canceled when tweets from 2011 surfaced showing her bullying teenager Courtney Stodden. The Me Too movement has to be one of the biggest driving forces of cancel culture. Ushered in by Alyssa Milano in 2017, this movement encouraged women and men to expose sexual predators and their harmful actions as an act of feminist solidarity. While those like Weinstein were reprimanded harshly, and rightly so, stories about those like Aziz Ansari raise questions about what counts as a cancelable offense. For example, in the Babe.net expose, writer Katie Way tells the story of Grace, who went on an awkward and uncomfortable date with Ansari. Grace tells the writer, quote, I believe I was taken advantage of by Aziz. I was not listened to and ignored. It was by far the worst experience with a man that I've ever had, end quote. Many older feminists jumped to criticize the story for tarnishing the moral grounding of the Me Too movement, since Grace's story more so features an instance of awkwardness and miscommunication rather than an assault. So this raised questions on what a cancelable offense truly is, and this is the subject of my talk today. What is the foundation that undergirds the impulse to cancel someone? One might say it is simply politics or a fast-track route to accruing attention and fame. While these are certainly significant components, the philosophies in question are, again, morality and credibility. To cancel someone is to put their moral character up for display on this digital jumbotron. And since canceling someone usually happens to someone with fame and power, it aims to discriminate this person's popularly accepted credibility. As a teacher of first-year composition, cancel culture offers a convenient chance to teach ethos through this lens. While we typically define ethos through credibility, morality is also an important component. Aristotle mostly touches on this in his work, the Nicomachean Ethics, and he categorizes ethos into three categories: phronesis, as handy skills and practical wisdom; arete, which stands for virtue and goodwill; and eunoia, which extends goodwill towards the audience. Note that the speaker is not necessarily foregrounded in Aristotle's definition. Rather, rhetoric hinges on the relationship between the audience and the speaker as anchored by their shared sense of morality and desire for goodwill. So why am I taking you back to ancient Greece and offering this rhetoric lesson? Well, when I teach my students, I spare them from Aristotle as much as I can, but I do tell them that the original conception of an appeal like ethos was meticulously designed to put morality and credibility into close connection. This is important when we talk about cancel culture, as it assumes a mass consensus on right and wrong behaviors. Let me say it again. As it assumes a mass consensus on right and wrong behaviors when people insist on canceling a certain figure. And this assumption is critical, as it offers a moment for us to reflect on what communal values people think we share. For instance, in the Kaepernick case, the assumption from those companies who desponsored him for kneeling during the national anthem assumed that this is an insult to the country and to those who sacrificed their lives in war. In addition, these companies that desponsored him assumed that Black Lives Matter was not a cause that warranted this form of protest. These values were shared in a particular community and reflects the values they believe everyone should share. But there's a conflict in that different communities hold different values for different reasons. To circle back to a very Aristotelian conversation, we might mistake the particular for the universal. In first-year composition, this is a key course outcome, to expand students' minds to consider how various perspectives not only exist, but interact with one another on the same subject. Opening our minds in this way is no easy feat, but it is just one way that we can begin to unveil the deeper layers behind the impulse to cancel. So here's my typical lesson plan. First, students come to class having read Jonah E. Bromwick's Everyone is Canceled from the New York Times in 2018, and the article version of The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt in The Atlantic in 2015. These pieces were written at the beginning of cancel culture cognizance that ask important, nuanced questions about the act of canceling. In this class session, I start by bluntly presenting them with the question of, what is cancel culture? What do you think when you hear this term? This prompts the students to consider how they've heard this term circulating before and what it means to them. Notably, some students shoot their hands up in excitement to speak on something political, but others sit there uncomfortably as they think I might be tricking them or forcing them to say what they think I want them to say. This cold call, however, works to get the juices flowing so that the students can form their thoughts on their own without being preempted. Next, we talk about ethos. We define it and its examples from the well-known textbook, Everything's an Argument. Last time I taught this lesson, I was using the 6th edition. So we worked through some of the key concepts on ethos, and we worked through some of the examples. So this is a slide that I present to my students directly. So I show that ethos is all about character. It hinges on that credibility and the virtue. And it's a bit of an outdated example now, since the last time I taught this was in 2020. But the Tim Tebow example is a good one in that sort of his good guy ethos was put on display in a pro-life Super Bowl ad that he made for the Christian group focused on the family. So his ethos as a humble Christian guy, as he's known on the field, made him appealing to Christian audiences watching the pro-life Super Bowl ad, because they know him as a famous athlete, but they also trust him based on his values. So ethos is how a speaker connects with the audience based on those shared values. So it asks the question, how much can we trust someone? How much credibility do they have? And why should we trust them? So I talk with them about the three main elements of ethos, what I believe are some of the key three main elements, which would be trustworthiness / credibility, authority, and unselfish or clear motives. All of these add up to ethos, which I think dovetails really nicely with the example of cancel culture. So I asked them to think about the concept of trustworthiness. So how trustworthy is a person speaking? What do we know about them, their beliefs, and their value system? How trustworthy is a person speaking? What do we know about them, their beliefs, and their value system? And what are their motives for speaking on this? Are they trying to hide their motives? Whose interests are they serving? So this is a visual that I provide my students of ethos. So we sort of have something kind of resembling the rhetorical triangle, but we have ethos, which is sort of this umbrella for these two prongs that I focus on that work simultaneously, which is morality and credibility. And again, those who are deemed as moral tend to be more credible, and you attain credibility by showing moral behavior. So again, we walk through this in terms of rhetorical analysis. So if students were to analyze an instance of cancel culture for their rhetorical analysis assignment, this is analyzing via ethos is one of the big factors. And again, I break down the three main rhetorical appeals for each day. So again, this is our ethos day. So we talk about when writers are speaking and they're trying to be persuasive, they're using ethos and trying to convey their strong moral character and credibility. When we do a rhetorical analysis of somebody's writing, we must ask about their ethos. How credible and reliable are they on the subject? Do their own virtues match what they're saying? When controversies arise around people in the news, their character is often called into question. #MeToo and conversations on cultural appropriation and political correctness often call into question someone's character on ethos. And we tend to hold famous people up on a high pedestal because we look up to them. So cancel culture questions someone's character and virtues. We go over other notable examples. Again, at this point in 2022, this is a little bit outdated. This is the last time I taught this. So in the Brownwood article that I have them read, he writes that, quote, cancel culture was born of a desire for control. People have limited power over what is presented to them on social media platforms, which are notorious for being poorly regulated. When YouTube refuses to defenestrate Logan Paul after he posted a deeply insensitive video in December, she said individuals were compelled to take matters into their own hands, doing the work of deplatforming him instead of waiting on deliverance from YouTube. So this is just one example of cancel culture, and no two stories are alike. So, same slide there. So before concluding my presentation, I want to sort of just relay how this typically goes. So the last time I taught this was at Ohio University, right before the pandemic. And we had a mix of conservative and liberal students, and they both conveyed their perspectives right away. And some people think canceling is warranted sometimes, and a lot of times the accusations are correct. And then others are very, very adamant in their hatred for cancel culture. And I let them air everything out. We have a discussion, make sure things are civil. But by the end of this lesson, students, in my experience, really tend to come away with a more nuanced understanding of cancel culture, because we foregrounded harshly the fact that when we cancel someone, it's displaying a certain community's values that they believe everybody should share. And so it's very much based on these different pockets, these different communities. It's based on what shared values we all have, and it's very contextual. No two situations are alike. And I find that this lesson is very, very important to teach, especially now. And I think teaching again from semester to semester, as Lexi said in her presentation, you want to make sure that you have relevant examples for students to draw upon. That way they're familiar with what you're talking about. And, I taught this in 2020 before the pandemic. We still have acts of cancellation going on today, or things that could be coded as cancellation. And so I think that in the 2020s, this is going to be a relevant political topic that I think that we should really take advantage of when we're teaching rhetoric. It not only helps students to understand these concepts for our courses, but allows them to be smarter and more critical consumers of media, which I find to be extremely important. So if you would like to talk about this more, if you would like to talk about this more, my email is Stroup, STROUP, @umda.edu. And my Twitter is Rachel_Stroup. Please feel free to reach out to me. And I encourage you to take inspiration from this presentation and all of our presentations to try to inspire your pedagogy. On behalf of Lexi and Erin, I'd like to thank you all for tuning into this presentation. Again, here is our contact information. We encourage you to reach out, ask questions. We would love to keep this conversation going.